The following webinar was recorded as part of the original implementation of IWISH and has been made available for informational purposes only. Some portions of the original recording have been cut to ensure participants' privacy. References to the Lewin Group, implementation team, site liaisons, PHL, Google Drive, and some forms are not applicable to the demonstration extension effective October 1st, 2020. Terms and conditions of grantee's cooperative agreement supersede any information presented here. Please see the IWISH Operations Manual for the most up-to-date implementation information.
Well, it's 2 p.m. over here on the East Coast, and I believe it is about 11 p.m. over there on the West Coast, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Welcome to Developing an IWISH Emergency Protocol. We're so excited that you are able to join us today. For those who may be joining us for the first time or need a friendly reminder, our sessions are designed to be interactive and we want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts, your questions, and anything that you're interested or glad that you heard today. So please remember to use the chat function, and then when it's time for Q&A, to raise your hand so we can unmute your phone. Next slide. And be sure to select all participants when asking questions related to the content, so that way everyone can hear or read your response and your questions and your comments. Next slide. Well, I see that our veterans have already started letting us know that they are here on the line. So if you have not already, please be sure to enter in your name, your role, and your site. And of course, if you are watching with your colleagues, please be sure to list the name of everyone that is watching with you. Today, we have 3 primary objectives that we hope to achieve. Number 1, we want to help you understand the importance of an IWISH emergency protocol. So as you know, you're working with residents who are aging, and anything can happen at any time, any emergency, whether it's a fall or, unfortunately, a heart attack. And so we hope to explain and discuss why it's important to have this emergency protocol in place for both the resident wellness director and the wellness nurse. And then, as many of you all are still in the process of developing your protocol, we want to give you an opportunity to hear and learn from the process that other sites have taken to develop their own protocol. Finally, we want to add some clarity and provide guidance on what may be included in an IWISH emergency protocol. What questions should you think about? What details should you include in your protocol? So to kick off today's discussion, we want to start with a quick poll. We want to know, what is your site's emergency protocol? We know that we have a wide spectrum. Some of you guys have your protocol developed and it's been approved, and some of you all may not have even known that you needed an emergency protocol. We hope not too many are in that category, but take a moment to respond to the poll. What is your site's emergency protocol status? Thank you all for responding. You have a couple more seconds to respond to the poll. Or actually, you have 1 more minute. We've extended the time. So 1 more minute to respond. All right, here we go. So what did you all say? Where are you all on your emergency protocol status? Waiting for the poll results to trickle in. So we have about 10 of you all that have developed your emergency protocol and has been approved by your management and legal. We have a couple of you all that are still in the process by collecting resources. That's where most of you all kind of fall in that middle area where you're not at the beginning, but you're not quite at the end. And then we have only a few sites that are hoping to leave or to start creating your protocol based on what you hear today. So that's good. I'm glad that we have a wide spectrum. And wherever you fall on that spectrum, we do hope that this webinar today provides useful information for you. So I'm going to hand it over to Alicia to kind of help frame for us why we do have an emergency protocol for IWISH. Alicia?
Happy to be here with you again this week. So could we go to the next slide, Nora, please? So as Joy said, I'm just going to talk about why it is we're asking you to have an emergency protocol for your IWISH site. So certainly IWISH staff and other property staff that are working with the residents and participants and IWISH staff really need to have clear guidance regarding how they are going to respond in the event of an emergency. And having a protocol will help you be prepared for these situations where you have to think quickly and might have time to think about what a proper response would be. We also know that not all emergencies are black and white. For example, a fall can really range anywhere from minor to very serious. And having a protocol in place around some of these areas that could be more gray really help guide the staff on having an appropriate response for your organization and knowing that you're all on the same page in your response. And it's not just about knowing what to do, but ensuring that you've thought in advance about that your response of what you plan to do is not going to expose the organization to legal liabilities, because we all know in these emergency situations there's a potential for an inappropriate or an unintended response. So you really want to make sure that you have considered all the risks with your response and people know how to respond accordingly. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Good. So there's no one version of an emergency protocol. We want to make that really clear with you all. Each site's protocol is going to reflect the policies and approaches of the two partner organizations that have come together to discuss it, along with the nature of their state laws that relate to the activities that are happening at the housing site and with the residents. So the speakers today are going to share with you how their organizations are approaching their protocol. And this will give you the chance to hear how others are doing it, what other approaches and components people are considering, and maybe you can consider those as you're developing or refining yours, since many of you are in the process of developing and refining at this moment. And even though some of you that may have finished it, you might hear some other things that are of interest or value, or you may get some confirmation of what you have done. And that you feel comfortable with what you have. So as you're listening today to our speakers, and we're very grateful to our colleagues who have, at the IWISH site, your fellow colleagues who have offered to share with us today, we want you to think about how, is there anything you hear from them that could help you enhance or revise or adapt anything that you see needed in your current IWISH protocol, wherever you may be in the process. And then at the same time, think about if you're not done yet, what are the next steps you need to take to get it to cross the finish line and get it all in place and sewn up and ready to be enacted. So next slide, please. I think right now I am handing it over to Angela from Rush University, who is going to tell us about their approach with their IWISH site.
Can we go to the next slide and we'll get started? So I wanted to frame it with some basic key things to consider when you're thinking about developing your emergency protocol. And the very first thing is just basically to recognize that both organizations, both the IWISH site and the nursing service provider, very likely already have emergency protocols in place that will direct their employees on what to do in the case of an emergency situation. So the crux of the matter is trying to find common ground between those two currently existing policies. And so that was our approach. We started with, rather than creating something from scratch, we chose to start with the two policies that were already in place at both organizations. And so one thing that we learned as we were looking at both of these policies is that we very quickly realized that some of the basic language used by both organizations had slight nuances or differences in how we were thinking about what comprised an emergency situation. So it's important, and there's a million different examples. One might be, for example, a nurse might recognize, or for the nursing employer, they might recognize, crushing chest pain as one type of an emergency or a fall as one type of an emergency, whereas the IWISH site recognizes it as a different kind of emergency, and therefore there were different protocols or different kind of direction on what to do. So that was something that we realized very early on, and we realized that we had to come to some common ground in terms of definition and language when talking about emergency situations. So that was one thing to consider. Another thing to consider or to keep in mind is that remember that the nurse, our goal in all of this is to help keep our residents safe and healthy and well and aging in place. And with that in mind, that the wellness nurse is a trained medical professional with certification and licensure to kind of recognize and triage and do something, like to do something medical in the case of an emergency situation. And so we kind of, with that in mind, we recognize that, yes, there is a difference, that the wellness nurse could do some things that perhaps the IWISH site employees might not be able to do. So that was kind of the basic premise of our approach. Next slide, please. So the very first thing that we did was we scheduled a formal time where the IWISH site management and the nursing services, so it was myself as the nursing supervisor and the wellness nurses, to sit down and have a conversation to review and discuss the current emergency policies for both organizations. And in doing that, we've really got a sense of those differences that I was talking about, where one organization might view a situation as an emergency, where the other organization, it's not an emergency. It would be certainly cause for alarm, but it wouldn't trigger an emergency protocol. So, and in having that conversation, we realized that both parties were very happy with the current emergency protocols that were in place by their organizations. And by that, I mean, so we at that point, we thought we had two options. We could write a new policy that would supplement the two emergency protocols that were in place at both organizations, or we could maybe revise one or both of the currently existing policies, and to incorporate the IWISH protocol and the wellness nurse being on site. And in that conversation, we realized that both organizations wanted to keep the emergency protocol that they currently had in place, which led us to the development of a third, what we've been calling a bridge policy, to address the differences between the two existing policies. I hope that makes sense. Next slide, please. So once we discussed, we got together as a group and we discussed it, then we identified a point person to sit down and compose a draft of our bridge policy. In our case, we recognize that this was a joint effort from both organizations, but in our case, it helped to identify one point person to help move this forward. And in this case, it was me as the nursing supervisor. I think in our case, it organically was the nursing side of the partnership because, again, because we were more comfortable in identifying emergency situations. And so for whatever reason, in our case, it organically happened that way. But I think either party, either the IWISH site or the nursing supervisor or nursing employer could do the writing part of this. So after we met, I got written copies of both organizations' emergency protocols and reviewed them in detail. And then I summarized each protocol, and myself and the wellness nurses summarized each protocol in 3 to 4 sentences on what we were thinking of as like a cover sheet or a one-page document. And then we got to the crux of it, which was composing language explaining how or why the wellness nurse might initiate life-saving measures. For us, it was important to keep the language. We went back and forth on the language for what the wellness nurse might do, and we decided to keep the language as broad as possible. I'm sure some of you can relate to all the what-if scenarios. If you start thinking about emergency situations and you can say, well, what if this happens? Then what does the nurse do or the on-site staff do? Or what if this? And then you can kind of go down this rabbit hole, and the scenarios are really endless and impossible to predict. So what we did was we chose very intentionally to use language deferring to the nurse's clinical judgment, recalling that the nurse, again, through employment at our organization, through state licensure requirements, through national, certification for CPR and so on, that the nurse is a trained medical professional, and so therefore under their license has a clinical judgment that where they can determine in the situation what might need to happen. And so that was a little bit that our risk management office seemed to like that a little bit better as well, rather than trying to describe every single possible emergency situation, which would be impossible. So that was an important distinction for us and was a big break in this whole process that allowed us to move forward to the next step. So the next step, next slide, please. So the next step for us was once we had the bridge policy language drafted and written, you have to have vetting from both legal departments, both the nursing employer and also from the IWISH site. And so that's where we are right now in the process. Our Office of Risk Management on the nursing side has already approved of the concept and with the bridge language, kind of bridging the two policies. Right now we're kind of nitpicking some of the words a little bit, but for the most part the policy is ready to move forward. And so I would say, so in our case, we do have an Office of Risk Management here in the medical center so that we were able to tap into those resources. If you don't have an Office of Risk Management, then certainly your legal team from your organization would be able to vet a bridge policy document such as this. Next slide, please. So once it's vetted by legal and risk management, the IWISH site management, IWISH staff, then it's time to get back together and have another meeting face-to-face. In our case, that's what we will do, is we'll meet face-to-face to review and discuss, answer any questions. We thought it was important to include the property staff at this point because the property staff are sometimes the front line I guess, responders in the case of an emergency. So, for example, someone who might be at the front reception desk might get a call from a resident that they've, fallen and hit their head or something like that. And so we want to make sure that everybody in the building who may be called upon to respond to an emergency situation will know what to do in relation to the wellness nurse being on site. Next slide, please. So again, just to summarize, the key sources that we tapped into to develop or throughout this process really was the Illinois State Nurse Practice Act, other relevant guidelines in terms of employment guidelines for here at Rush. For example, all of our nurses have to have their CPR certification renewed annually along with first aid and basic life support. So we know that that system is already in place. We also, consulted with the IWISH site management because we certainly wanted to make sure that the bridge protocol, emergency protocol that we developed, everybody's comfortable with it. And then possibly most important in all of this is the wellness nurse, his or herself, to make sure that they're on board with the language and they fully understand what they're supposed to do in emergency situations if they're on site. Next slide, please. So is the actual draft of our bridge emergency protocol. You can see up at the top, this is an important distinction at the very, very top. The title of the document is Emergency Protocols for the IWISH Wellness Nurse. So this is specific for the wellness nurse. So this directs the wellness nurse what to do, not necessarily the wellness directors or other staff that might be at the IWISH site. This is specific to the wellness nurse. So you can see the first paragraph, kind of section there, is document 1, where we summarized what the policy is for the site, or what to do in medical emergencies. Document 2 is what the IWISH site does in the case of a medical emergency. And then most importantly, this third paragraph is the language about what the wellness nurse can do if he or she is on site when a medical emergency call occurs. And you can see in the second line there, it says the nurse will act upon their best clinical judgment in providing emergency care and or CPR resuscitation. So the next important distinction with this, and this was suggested by our Office of Risk Management, is that because this is a little bit outside of the scope of the IWISH guidelines for providing emergency care on site, and also it's a little bit outside of the realm of the emergency protocol for our organization, for the nursing employer. And so in this, we referred to the Illinois Good Samaritan laws to protect professional nurses and CPR certified individuals from legal action for emergency care that's provided in good faith and without compensation. And so that is how we addressed the risk management and liability questions on, for example, if someone initiates CPR on a resident and they have a bad outcome, then the Illinois Good Samaritan law is what would be the liability kind of fallback in that scenario. Although the wellness nurse would be provided legal counsel from the employer, from Rush, but we would invoke the Illinois Good Samaritan law in that situation. Next slide, please. So lessons learned in this, the key conversations between parties is crucial. And again, way back on my very first slide, I mentioned that we got all of our key stakeholders in this. So the IWISH management, the nursing supervisor, the wellness nurse, and the wellness directors all together at the table to talk about the differences between the two policies and what each organization was comfortable with in terms of how to move forward. So that was really important. I imagine our final, once we present the final document, will be equally important once we apply and adopt this into practice on the site. Another big lesson learned is, I'm laughing, expect multiple drafts and revisions before complete. We've been working on this about 6 to 8 weeks now. I'm trying to think back on our timeline. So we've been working on this for a while, going back and forth between the legal departments and reviewing, the Illinois Nurse Practice Act and other various things. So it's taken some time. So I would advise to, plan on that, like plan for several months and various iterations of the whatever you come up with for your own organization. There will be many revisions back and forth. And then finally, flexibility in terms of what the final product will be is also key. So both parties ultimately need to be comfortable with the final bridge policy. They need to be comfortable with the liability language. So again, here in Illinois, we have the Good Samaritan law that we're able to fall back on. I know there's other states where that's not the case. So, or the details of the law might be different state to state. So it's important to make sure that the both legal offices sign off on both. And so next slide. I think that's where we're at. Should I turn it back over to Alicia or Joy?
Hi, Angela. You're going to turn it over back to both of us.
Okay.
We're going to tag team this. So now we want to hear from you all. We want to know, we want to give you a moment to reflect and share with us how can you enhance your current IWISH emergency protocol. So use the chat box. Remember to select all participants for whom you're going to send this to and let us know how can you enhance your current IWISH emergency protocol, and then also what are the next steps you'll take to get your emergency protocol in place. So give about a minute and a half to kind of think about these questions and share your responses in the chat.
While you are thinking, I want to ask Angela a question, if I might, but I also want to note that you all may have questions for Angela, and don't fear, we are going to provide some time for questions at the end after we have a couple more of your colleagues talk to us. But Angela, I wondered if I could ask you about your approach to falls so that we could clarify with that. As I understand, you all are going to be considering falls as a separate policy outside of this emergency bridge policy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So both organizations, in our case, also have separate fall policies currently in place. So, for example, here at Rush, we have like an emergency, a medical emergency protocol, and then we have a fall protocol. So, and the same is true at the IWISH site, although the outcome at the IWISH site is the same, that's to call 911, but ours here for at our organization from the nursing side is very different. So our plan is once we finish everything with the emergency protocol, the medical emergency protocol, then we plan to go through the same process from start to finish with the falls protocol and we'll probably come up with, I imagine, a bridge falls protocol as well. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you for that clarification.
Oh, so we have one question come in, and we have a couple of comments. She asked, since one of our missions is to empower our residents, how about offering for them to be on their own type of rapid response team or committee?
Joy, Erica, I'm not quite sure if I understand the question. Angela, I'm not sure if you do, please feel free to speak to it, but if not, maybe we could ask Erica to speak up and give us a little more information.
This is Angela. I'm not sure either, but I think, Erica, are you thinking that a rapid, so like if in the case of an emergency, then the residents would triage or be the first responders in an emergency situation?
Angela, I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but it looks like Erica said to your question, yes, within their capabilities.
Oh, I see. Okay. That's an interesting idea. I don't think, I can't think of any reason for that not to be in place. The only thing I would say is if the wellness nurse, if the emergency happens while the wellness nurse is on site, then I think then the triage group, the triage team of residents would want to tap into that knowledge and expertise and clinical judgment. So I think it might still have the same sequela or outcome from the nursing perspective. So if there's a triage team that's residents, or if it's the receptionist at the front desk, whomever is triggering, some kind of response or recognition that there's an emergency situation at hand, then I think that would be fine. From my perspective, I would just want the nurse to be part of it as well if they're on site.
Okay, thank you, Angela. And Joy, do we have time for go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to read off some of the other comments that we received. Sharonda Carter says, be mindful of the resident's DNR status. And then Denise Villa says, enhance training members to become familiar with the process. And she said in terms of next steps, review for consistency among sites.
Angela, Joy, could I interrupt 1 second and ask Angela? Angela, do you all have a particular approach to the DNR status?
Yes. So, and we went back and forth on this many, many times when we were writing our own protocol, the bridge protocol. What we ultimately decided to do was leave reference to DNR status out of the bridge protocol because if you think about it, there may be residents who might be in an emergency situation but aren't enrolled in the IWISH program, and so we might not know, the nurse might not know their DNR status, which would be the same as if the nurse is walking down the sidewalk and encounters, somebody on the ground that needs emergency life-saving measures. So according to the Illinois Good Samaritan law, in the case of an emergency situation, if the DNR status is unknown and anybody, a medical professional initiates life-saving measures and they're a DNR, then the Illinois Good Samaritan law protects that individual from any negative sequela as a result of that. So again, that might be different in other states. So reviewing the Good Samaritan law iteration in your own state is a good idea because it's a nice fallback it worked really well for us for these purposes for the bridge protocol. And then obviously so what would happen is if, a resident is down and needs CPR and the DNR status is unknown, the nurse happens to be there and initiates CPR, and then, someone finds out later that the resident was in fact a DNR, then we would invoke the Good Samaritan law. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Is there any concern, Angela, about whether you do know if the person has a DNR or not? Is it standard to just assume you don't know? No?
Well, no, it's not standard. So in our case, I think it would be fair to conclude, in our case anyway, because we have two full-time wellness nurses at our site, they're going to get to know the residents really well and will very likely know their DNR status. So for using best clinical judgment, and again, going back to licensure requirements for nurses and so on, if someone is a DNR, then you would provide supportive emergency, like kind of supportive medical care versus emergency life-saving medical care. So if someone is a DNR and the nurse is on site, then they just would, using their best clinical judgment, they would not initiate CPR, but they would initiate other comfort measures. They would still call 911 and follow the rest of the protocol. Does that make sense?
Great. Okay, thank you.
Great questions, Alicia. Thank you all for putting your comments inside the chat box. We're going to move forward, but please continue to share inside the chat. We are reading. Angela will also be able to see them. We're going to move to our next to tell us about their emergency protocol.